Ray, welcome and thank you for joining us. Thanks for taking the time. It's awesome to have you here with us today. Can you tell me a little bit more about yourself and what brought you here?
Okay. Well, first of all, Ellen, I'm calling from our innovation center here in Bonn, in Troisdorf, which is already a great place to come if you've got some ideas or some things that you'd look at for the future logistics. So, open invitation to anybody that would like to come to the innovation center here. So just feel free to reach out. Maybe a bit of background about myself. So I've been with DHL for almost 3 decades now. So I know I look a little bit younger, but I am indeed in my mid-50s. Always working in a service logistics context, so quite some experience with a number of industries and more than 200 clients. And one of my sort of focus areas, shall we say, for the last sort of 2 or 3 years has really been this sort of final mile delivery problem in the likes of MedRep boots and consignment stock in hospitals and likes of those types of environment. Now, this is something which is quite close to my heart as well. Is that when I was back in the days when I was a grad student, I actually spent 2 years working on a hospital in the UK. Working across many different departments in various different roles, though I was a student, and some of the strange practices that I observed, back when I was a little bit younger, still and cover some of those.
Would you mind repeating just the last bit? I don't know if it was on my end, but I lost sound connection there for just a bit.
No worries. So I was just saying, some of those learnings or some of those observations I had from working in hospital environment, we'll cover in today's session. And, hopefully everybody will find that valuable. And if you've got questions, I would naturally encourage you to drop it in the chat. And, we'll try and answer it as best we can.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that would be hugely valuable. That's also why we set up the webinars as a kind of interactive thing. So absolutely, I would encourage anybody who has a question to drop it to us in the chat and we would be more than happy to cover it. So if I take a look at the slides that you sent to me, Ray, this is the first one. Yeah, I'm looking at some very different or very variable equipment things here.
Indeed. So, first of all, I just wanted to reassure everybody that, I'm not here to sell you anything, first of all, right? So, really this is about sharing experience. And, one of the things that I've learned, across many decades of working in a services environment is that, there's multiple challenges that need to be addressed. And, especially in the life science space, there is, lots of very different challenges. And, this is just an illustration of 4 different product groups. And when you think about hospitals being almost mini cities, and, large and complex places, with many different roles and many different departments and, many different people running around, then that just exacerbates the situation more than anything else. So so if I start on the left, really, and you talk about your diabetes devices, right? So first of all, these devices are quite small in many respects, very much personal. So they attach to the hip, for example, or they might be strapped to an arm. And these are for the most part quite a straightforward device. But they do have a number of attributes that need to be tracked. The battery life of the device itself, its batch number, it has a model number or a part number that goes with it. It has many different pieces of information. They're not especially high value, but there are a few different variations of this with a number of different manufacturers. When you sort of move over into implantable devices, so this might be your sort of hip joints or knee joints or something like that, or even a pacemaker in this particular case. Imagine you've got planned surgeries or trauma surgeries where you've got many different devices that need to be used in the surgery itself. And all of these devices or all of these consumables or even tools, even in many cases, have to be tracked and have to be logged as, in terms of being used in that surgery. And again, many of these different items have 3, 4, 5, 6 different pieces of information that are attached to each device that all needs to be captured from a regulatory perspective. You then move on to the diagnostics equipment, and of course, diagnostics are becoming, increasingly important, right? So if you imagine the challenges that you have with antibiotic-resistant, viruses and bacterias, you almost need to do the diagnostics on the blood to determine what is the right treatment in terms of drugs for a particular complaint, right? So, diagnostics equipment, if you go back 20 years, it was all about, start with a generic antibiotic, and then depending on how the patient response was, you'd refine which antibiotic you were using. Now it's a little bit more diagnose the blood, choose the right antibiotic, and then you get a better response from the client, right? So from the patient. So you've got this sort of, real mixture of the types of devices that need to be tracked, the types of spare parts, and the complexity of that, right? So, capital equipment is a great example. You might have an item or a device or a spare part which is quite small, still has 3, 4, 5, 6 pieces of information about each item that you need to capture. But equally, you might also have a spare part which is 300 kilos, 400 kilos. A magnet for an MRI, again, it all needs to be tracked and managed, right? And because of the regulatory framework around, the medical environment, there's a lot of complexity. You really need to know that the product's been used, where it's been used, how it's been used, what batch number, what lot number. So the complexity is actually quite large, right?
I imagine the
Now,
fact that you have all these various brands and all these new technologies that are being developed, that only adds to your catalog of potential things that you have. Plus, I imagine like for the implantables, you actually have like a cluster of things, because you not only have the implantable device itself, but also all the tools that you need that surround that.
yeah, I mean, if you think about, if you go back, I don't know, let's take an example. You go back 20 years, the choices of drugs, the choices of devices that you had 20 years ago were a fraction of what you have now, right? You might have had your SKU list of 30 to 40,000 SKUs that you were managing as a hospital, right? And it was largely the hospital that managed the drugs, the devices, and the equipment at that point, right?
Mm-hmm.
Working with the different brands, working with the different companies, you would have a med rep that sort of came in and sort of stocked up the stock room and took a record of what's been used and what was left, and the med rep would manage that. If you imagine the proliferation of the material now that a hospital needs to manage, just in 20 years, you've gone from having, let's say, 50,000 different SKUs that you need to manage to almost 500,000 in some cases, right? For very large hospitals, and there's a few great examples in the UK for very large hospitals, you've got more than 500,000 different SKUs that you're managing, right? And on top of that, historically, the med reps used to do the management. More and more so, individual brand itself to consigned inventory very tightly within the hospital environment. So not only have you got this proliferation of products, you've got each brand wanting to manage it in a very different way, right? So you're getting to a point now where you've got entire rooms within the hospital that are just stuffed full of products, or that might have multiple different ways of managing it, and the complexity of that is just getting, exponential in many, many, many respects, right?
And this would then be for the nursing staff or for the hospital to manage, or who to whom does this ball get passed on, or this hot potato?
I mean, it's a bit of both, right? You've still got the med reps which visit and want to manage their particular material, right? And of course, the med reps know their material, so they know what to look for, they know what information to scan and stuff like that, right? But if you imagine a nurse who is looking at a shelf that might have 5, 10, 15 different providers' product on that shelf, which are all labeled in a different way, they're all managed in a different way, and some are very class leading in terms of how the technology that they use to manage, right? And some of them are not, right? So you've got this, the poor nurse whose really primary objective is trying to support the patient's needs as best she can. The second objective is to make sure that the hospital invoices that care, right, so that they can continue to exist. And management of the material is at best a close third, if not further down the list, right? So the more complex that environment becomes, the harder it is for those nursing staff to manage the equipment or manage the devices in a very good way, right? So it's getting too difficult, right? And each of the brands feel that they lose market share or they lose sales if there isn't sufficient stock on the shelf at the hospital or the clinic, right? So, you've got this constant push of material from the companies, from the brands, and the complexity and the poor old nurse that needs to manage that, right? So, we've got to find a better way to do that, right? Yeah. So, it might be a good idea maybe to, home in on some of the statistics a little bit there, Ellen. So, I don't know if you want to jump to the next slide. So if you think, I mean, here's just some basic statistics, right? I'll run through some of this, right? But just starting on the right a little bit, right? So one of the solutions that we piloted for a number of hospitals was this heartbeat tracker. So you see that attached to a DHL box there in the top right-hand corner, and those DHL boxes held a medical device. Now, the idea was that when these boxes moved around either the hospital or moved around, between hospitals, we could GPS track these particular items so that we always knew where they were at any one point in time. And as soon as you ripped the tracker off, of course, you knew then that the item was consumed, right? So in concept, it sounds really good, right? You know where it is, at what point it gets consumed, so because the tracker tracks that, right? Now, problem with this solution, it sounds like it solves the problem. In effect, it doesn't, right? And the reason why it doesn't is because, not only does the nursing staff now have to manage the medical device, which is within the box, but they also have to manage the tracker, right? Because the trackers are reusable. So they have to make sure that the trackers are then put in a bin that gets collected so that the trackers get used. And of course, what happened in the pilots is that the trackers were just getting lost. Right?
How do you lose a tracker?
Well, it goes in the regular bin, right? As opposed to the bin where they get recycled for reuse, right? So now not only are you asking the nurse to manage the inventory in a standardized way, but you're also asking them to manage a tracker as well. You're doubling the problem that you're asking the nursing staff to attack, right? So in concept, feels great. In reality, it was a bit of a disaster,
not so great,
right? So,
yeah.
So not so great, right? So, just staying with the statistics, you've got, there's quite some analytics on this, which are publicly available if anybody is interested. There's an analytics company called Finlistics where you can go to Finlistics, you can say, hey, can you give me a profile on a particular medical company? And they will provide the detail of what's going on with that medical company, right? So when we start talking to a client, we go to Finlistics, we pull a report on that client, and we look at what those clients' problems are, right? Now, the common theme, of course, is that just about all of the medical companies companies, doesn't matter who they are, whether they're pharmaceuticals, whether they're medical device, whether they're medical capital equipment or anything like that, is everybody's got way too much inventory, right? And, so we were looking at, 227 days in some cases of inventory sat on the shelf. And, when we were doing audits on, the inventory on the shelf in the hospital, easily more than 10% of that, of those medical devices, consumables, whatever it was, actually expires on the shelf. So if you think about, all of this stuff, all of this inventory is high value, right? And you're throwing away millions of euros worth of inventory every year because there's just too much of it. It's not well managed, and you're not pulling back the short code items and redeploying it to a fast-moving environment, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you've got that, massive problem that you've got with the inventory, which is just not getting better, right? Now, compounded on top of that, of course, and we've all seen issues with supply chain in the last months and the last year, is we have seen some remarkable improvements in the inventory holding for various companies, but that was because they couldn't source the product to deploy to the field. So while technically speaking, it looks like their inventory positions improved, it was because
the problem has just shifted.
The problem's just shifted because they couldn't source the inventory, right? The fundamental problem has not been solved, and that's looking at the problem holistically and working out a way to simplify the holding and administration of that device so that the nursing staff can focus on primary care and not have to work with
additional workloads to actually manage the stuff. If I look at your statistics, you have nearly 60% that actually only represent up to a third of the total value, whereas 30% is over a third of the total value. Does that then correlate with the difficulty of managing it? Can we say that the more valuable things are harder to manage, or is there no correlation between the two?
Well, it's kind of interesting, right? Is that you think that the higher the value of the inventory, the more it gets managed, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is probably true. But then the opposite applies, right? Is that the higher value inventory is the stuff that gets used the least often, right? And the high volume stuff tends to be lower value, right? It gets even worse when you talk about a med rep, because what you'll have is you'll have consigned stock in the hospital. You'll also have inventory in the med rep boot, right? And when you think about it, the inventory that's in the med rep boot, the guy really doesn't maintain it very well. It's inaccessible to anybody else other than the med rep, right? Unless you have a meeting in a car park somewhere and you're exchanging inventory, or doing a drug deal in a
I was just thinking that
using,
sounds fairly illegal. Yeah, that isn't the med rep that you're talking to, Ray. Be careful.
Yeah, but you can imagine the situation, right? You've got two med reps parked next to each other in the car park, switching boxes between cars, right? And again, it's not a good situation to be in, right? So, you start to think about, and so the problem is endemic. The problem needs to be looked at holistically. And then when you consider some of the technologies which are being used today, right? When you think about, a lot of the nursing staff, they're using laser-based scanners.
Mm-hmm.
And remember what I said earlier on about, having to scan multiple values on a product, right? And the nurses, trying to scan the right code, and the codes are located close to each other. She keeps scanning the wrong one or putting it in the wrong place. So it might take 2 or 3 attempts to, scan the right attributes into the right field so that they can record the, the actual usage of the item, right? So there's, a desperate need to try and streamline that. And, in a way, Ellen, I think this is where some of this sort of technology solutions that, we're looking at with Ventory start to come into play, right? Imagine the difference between, a nursing staff using a cell phone, which I'm sure that she's used before, right? Most people are comfortable using the camera on their cell phone and, and taking pictures with that. Imagine that the nursing staff, takes a picture of this medical device with their cell phone, right? And the artificial intelligence engine within the software then works out which part of the picture represents which data value, right? Instead of, getting frustrated with having to scan 5 different attributes in the right sequence at the right time,
Yeah,
she
I
just
was
takes a
just thinking that. I mean, that must be
simple
hugely
picture.
frustrating, especially if it's not already your primary job. You want to take care of your patients, and all this administrative work basically gets in the way. If it then also becomes an additional burden because it's not easy to do or it doesn't work as intended, that sounds like a recipe. I would throw my phone or something, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of different things, right? So if you imagine you're in the emergency room and the nurse runs to the stock room to get an item, right? And she has to scan all the different data attributes on the item. She keeps fluffing it up because she's, in a hurry, right? And the chances that the usage of that item not being recorded, because after the first try she gives up and she just goes off to save the patient, right?
Hmm.
If it's a simple take a picture, right, and that solves the problem. But then imagine also if you've got a nurse in a stock room that has 100 medical devices in it, and she has to do 2, 3, 4, 5 scans of each item, right? The item number, its expiry date, its lot date, maybe a UID number, something like that. So if she's got 100 items in that stock room, she's probably having to do 500 scans, right? So, think about, the new technology uses that, that we're promoting with Ventory, how, you just sit there, take pictures of all 100 parts and then walk out and you've done your cycle count,
Hmm.
right? I mean, the beauty of that type of model, right? So I think this is, just about, really making a very complex activity just incredibly simple by, the use of this type of technology, right?
Hmm. You mentioned looking at the problem holistically earlier on, so I think it makes sense to bring up this
Yeah.
slide, which you sent me.
Yeah, I think there's a combination of things that we're trying to do here. So one is, how do we simplify the work of the nurse that has to work with the hospital? How do we reduce the amount of space that is consumed in the hospital with the storage of medical devices and spare parts? And so there's a couple of concepts in play here. One is to pull back as much inventory as possible to a warehouse that's located very close to the hospitals, right?
Hmm.
Because that inventory is actually in a warehouse and it's accessible by everybody with the right access, of course, right? You don't have inventory like what you have with a med rep where it's inaccessible to anybody but that
Hmm.
med rep. That inventory can then be shared, right? So you're making better utilization of that inventory because it's now accessible, right? You've reduced the amount of inventory in the hospital to the bare essentials, right?
Hmm.
So you pull that inventory back. You've made the inventory management effort in the hospital much simpler by using the photography-based, AI-based scanning
Hmm.
rather than the laser scanning, right? And on top of that, if the med rep gets woken up at 3 o'clock in the morning, no longer does he need to drive to the hospital to deliver the item. He just calls the warehouse and says, hey, deliver this part to surgery
Hmm.
room number 1, right? Because there's an urgent surgery that's taking place, right? So you actually get, you've all looked at the problem holistically, right? And you've solved various issues by taking a more holistic approach, right? And what you're basically doing then is that you've got that, as we stated earlier on, you know, up to 227 days of inventory. we already see some of the top 5 brands that we're working with, reduce their inventory levels because now they don't have to have one of each in every MedRep's booth. They can have one in the warehouse, right? And they deliver it to the hospital when needed, right? As opposed to having 10 or 20 MedReps running around with 20 items instead of one, right? So it makes a huge amount of difference. Gives you an inventory reduction, simplifies the process in the hospital, and of course the quality then of the inventory improves. There's less waste, and based on the work that we've done with probably one of the largest med device companies, we see just with the top 5 med device companies, more than a $700 million benefit, and that's purely from inventory, right? And eliminating waste.
Yeah. So purely inventory that they don't need or don't yet need to avoid it accumulating in all these spots like the hospitals and the trunk stock of the medical representation.
Yeah. Well, and you think about some of the side benefits, right? Because you've got less product which is expiring on shelf, you've got less wastage. If you think about you've got less weight in the back of the MedRep cars, his carbon emissions are actually lower.
Positive externalities.
Yeah, I mean, these are all additional items, right? You also improve the quality of life of the MedRep because at 2 o'clock in the morning, he doesn't now need to get out of bed and drive. He just needs to wake up, make a phone call, right, and have it dispatched, right? And of course, the beautiful simplicity now of the eliminating a large amount of that frustration factor with the nurse of taking 100 pictures as opposed to making 500 scans, right? And the simplicity and the beauty of the whole model really comes out. So I'm quite pumped with some of this new technology and some of the new approaches. We're seeing a lot of traction with companies looking at this. It's just really a case of now, how do we change the culture almost and get better buy-in from the industry, because while some companies see the benefit, there's still a lot of disbelievers because they've always done it this way in the past, and it takes time to affect the change, of course.
Maybe, yeah, it sounds almost too good to be true. If you're used to working in a certain way, it's hard to take a hard look at what you're doing and how potentially, if you approach it from a different angle, it could be done way better.
Yeah, that change management is a massive piece to this, right? So, it's almost a case of finding somebody that's willing to work with you, that's willing to be the guinea pig, that's willing to trust that, and of course to give you the feedback. And of course, in some ways, it doesn't help that some of the previous pilot projects haven't gone as well as they could have done, because while it was solving the problem, it was actually creating more complexity in some ways as well, right? So we've got to work some of the kinks out. Still, I guess nothing's perfect on day one, but we just with that simple technology change, going from laser scanning to AI-based photography, right, is a really incredible step already. And
isn't it always the combination of the two? Because I can imagine there are circumstances where it makes sense to use the photography, and there are other circumstances where laser may be more robust because, for instance, the surroundings are not ideal, or there is a strange angle because things are really high up, for instance.
I mean, based on the simulated tests that we did, the average laser scanner only has a range of somewhere between 50 centimeters and a meter. We do have some scanners which can go 5, 10, 15 meters, but then your challenge, of course, is aiming the laser, right? And that gets a little bit more problematic when when you're doing that from distance. The thing with a photograph, if you're doing it with a decent resolution camera, right, on the phone, and of course a lot of phones now have 50 megapixel cameras, is you can actually zoom into the picture and get the resolution you need. So we've seen quite some promise, and I mean, of course there are cases where the laser is a better scenario, but the average case in this case, you've got the item in your hand and you take one picture, you don't then need to do 5 scans. So it's quicker, it's easier, there's less mistakes, right? And of course, you can support different labels and different vendors, because what you do is you train the AI to recognize the difference, right?
Yep.
So it's from my perspective, I'm quite pleased with the results. Of course, driving adoption now and and getting that deployed into a much greater environment is where we'd like to go next.
Yeah, I think that's always the key challenge, especially when you have a completely different way of tackling. I was at an event last week and I brought my pop-up roll-up warehouse with me so I could physically hand people the device to see, look how easy it is to just scan multiple barcodes in one go, and it just fills out the fields as it comes across them. For many people, it was really an eye-opener that it even existed, because it is so far removed from the traditional way of going like bleep, 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 scanning all these individual barcodes. Yeah, for sure. Very interesting.
Yeah, I can remember when I first showed it to a colleague who'd been a warehouse manager for many years, and he was a total disbeliever. Right now, you imagine that this particular individual who was almost 60. Of course, when he was a young warehouse manager, digital cameras didn't have a very good resolution. Whereas, the new generation of cameras are completely different, different animals, right? So, it was, chopped, right? But of course, there's always some pros and cons, right? I mean, it's not the silver bullet, so it was
No,
important
indeed.
to recognize
And
that.
it's like you mentioned, it's only when you go live that you come across issues that you had never even thought of, because you influence the ecosystem in such a way that you are also changing other parameters that you don't know beforehand you are going to change.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there is some good news on the horizon, as well as that a lot of the regulatory framework around medical devices is actually improving as well, right? So more and more companies are looking at using the UID standard, which basically puts all of the information into a single barcode or QR code, depending on what you're looking at, and then and sort of going from there. So you probably could still use a laser-based scan on that particular scenario, but I think the photography-based solution, I think, is more intuitive for a lot of people, to be quite frank.
Yeah, I think it, like you mentioned, it depends on the use case. Sometimes ergonomics will also work into it, that you have a kind of like a, what do you call it, a pilot or pistol shaped thing could be more ergonomic if you're using it an entire day as compared to your smartphone, but absolutely. I think also maybe there is a call there to, I don't know if there is an authority on this, but there should be like an industry standard, I feel, rather than every brand or everybody just pretty much going at it the way that works for them individually.
Yeah, I think UID is one thing to look at. I think because that the EU certainly is trying to make it easier, right? And while Big Brother might be irritating at times, I think in this respect they're actually onto something. So standardization, I think, is important. But I think the greatest threat at the moment, I think, is that until people start to manage this inventory in a structured way, the proliferation of the different storage technologies and the different management technologies just make a nightmare for the hospital, right? They'll very often have rooms full of different cabinets, different companies that store the high value items for those different companies, right? So because they weren't managed effectively in the past, right? So, does this also help go away to eliminating the need for a number of these cabinets, because the cabinet's there to force adherence and to try and drive a high quality standard. But if we can get to a simple model, and that also takes away the complexity as to having to go to a cabinet and punch in a code and retrieve the item, and again, that's you're adding complexity to the task of the medical staff, right? So again, how do we bring this back to a nice, simple standard, and eliminate some of these, band-aid solutions which are being deployed.
Yeah, I was thinking of that when you showed me the statistics earlier. If you have something that is spending over 200 days on a shelf, times 20 or 30 suppliers, you have rooms upon rooms that are filled with equipment that's collecting dust that could be put to much better use.
Yeah, and as a consequence, you might be having hospitals that don't get the inventory they need because, the brand itself has already exceeded its inventory budget, right? So, I think there's the sustainability aspect as well, right? I mean, if you can produce less because you're not writing it off, you're also improving your carbon emissions as well, right? So there's just so many benefits here, right? But it all starts with that change management, that simplification, that's making the key user's life much easier, and by a very smart use of the technology, right? Another great example is you think about what the cost of a scanner is, right? Scanners can be 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 euros each. A basic cell phone that would do this activity, that would connect directly to a connection point, these can be had for 300 or 400 euros now, right? So I mean, there's lots of opportunity here. I think it's just about how do you move that forward.
Definitely.
So there we go. So I'm just kind of curious, Ellen, whether there's any sort of questions from the audience, or whether there's anything that they're particularly interested in.
So far in the chat, I don't see any questions yet, but I had asked people to send me their questions or topics that they definitely wanted to see beforehand. So I have a couple of questions that I have received from people via email. I'd say one question is, what is wrong with the current technologies and the way it is done today? Can we not continue or further evolve that one? I'm paraphrasing.
Yeah, I remember looking at, I'm just trying to remember the company actually. I think it was either a zebra or a symbol scanner. And this goes back to my point about the laser scanner. It was a laser-based technology. Of course, that relies on the individual scanning the barcodes in the right sequence, or if it's a QR code, scanning the QR code, but then having the right response on that QR code. But these legacy devices, you've got this 2,000, 3,000 euro value each, as I just said, right? And I think the conversation that needs to be had now is almost, is there a way that we can work with the scanning companies or the hardware companies to, offer two different variations of these scanners, one that works on the AI-based technology, one that works on the traditional laser, right? And I'm actually convinced that, when they work out how much more sophisticated and intelligent they can make their software using the photography-based scan, the laser-based scanning is going to become less and less prevalent, because laser-based in many ways is quite dumb, right? Whereas the photography method is, you can apply a lot of logic and artificial intelligence, machine learning to that.
Another question I received is regarding the investment side. So imagine that you have a temporary contract as a supplier. How do you go about investing into maybe a shared architecture or a shared almost what do you call it, the boxes or cupboards where you are keeping your supplies? How do you divide that financial burden?
Yeah, that's a really tough one to crack, right? And I think it depends on the commercial model that the hospital has with their suppliers, right? So in the UK, you would have the NHS, and the NHS basically does centralized purchasing, right? So in a way, they've already got that standardized commercial model, so the hospital can manage their inventory in a very standardized way. Outside of the UK, where you've got each hospital has its own relationship with their own commercial relationship with the vendor of the med device or spares or capital equipment, right? You've got this diverging standards of how each inventory is managed, right? So it's, unfortunately, there isn't one size that fits all again. You've got this difference in the operating model of the hospital. And then, of course, even within, you know, a particular country, there might be a chain of clinics or a chain of vet surgeries or something like that, which you could, you could agree a very simplified, standardized model, right? But there's no clear standard today, Ellen, and I think that's something.
Comes back to standardization.
Yeah. And the challenge is, of course, that the larger the hospital, the more that they want to try and negotiate their own discounts with the companies as well, because each hospital very often is its own profit center, and they try and focus their consumption on particular brands to reduce the number of brands they're working with. But then, each surgeon's got his own preference as to the devices and the therapies that he wants to use, right? So again, you've got this natural tension between the hospital want to simplify and standardize, and yet the surgeon, who might be a very high-powered, high-value surgeon, who's got a preference for a particular piece of medication or med device or therapy or tool or something that's used in the surgeries that he's an expert in, right? So it's going to take us a while to solve that, but we need to start somewhere. That's for sure.
That's an excellent point. Let me move on to the last slide to basically maybe ask of you, what, if any, what are the key things that you would want our audience to take home or take away from our talk today?
I think there's probably two main points that I would advocate at this point, right? Is that many people see an inventory problem and say, look, we need to reduce our inventory, right? And there's an absolute focus on the inventory, right? And very often to the detriment of the availability of the inventory or the sales of the inventory, right? So what I would encourage is, one, to look at the problem holistically, not just to focus in on it's an inventory problem, therefore I must solve the inventory. What we've seen is by changing the operating model actually helps reduce inventory without necessarily focusing on inventory. And of course, simplification. How do you make the end user's life easier, right? So rather than just, having some beautiful solution that, gives you all of this sexy technology, is sometimes what you've got today is enough. Just making it easier and simpler to use is already a benefit, right? And I think those are probably the two key points, Ellen, that I would go to anybody with in terms of the model.